Chapter 5. Ahmad showed up in the bush at exactly 9 p.m. the next day. He came with his backpack full of his clothes and other personal items. He hadn't bought anything of real value since his arrival in the town. He was thus departing for the ZOBBO camp with pretty much what he had brought with him 5 weeks back. ZOBBO operatives typically traveled at night to evade the security forces. ZOBBO discreetly maintained a fleet of commercial passenger vehicles that operated at night and were patronized by people who loved to travel at night to avoid the notorious traffic on most of the nation's potholed highways. The vehicles also ferried ZOBBO personnel to various locations for deadly insurgency operations against the state. A vehicle was slated to leave at 10 p.m. for the town where ZOBBO's main camp was located. Once Ahmad and Sadiq were in the town, they would hop on ZOBBO motorcycles operated by ZOBBO fighters for a ride to the camp. At the camp, meanwhile, Aisha's 7th week of captivity had begun routinely. After enduring another night of repeated rape, she woke up, took her bath, prayed, and made breakfast for her husband and herself. She could engage in reluctant discourse with Omar now, after clamping her mouth shut and refusing to talk to him for the first 2 weeks of her forced marriage to him. Omar had come home the previous night from one of his endless meetings with the leadership, bearing ominous news. Many of the women who had a difficult time adjusting to life in the camp had been brainwashed to become suicide bombers. An operation was being planned to hit an army barracks in the biggest town in the state, and a number of the girls were in the team of bombers. Omar had been selected to command the mission, in which capacity he was responsible for logistics planning and taking the suicide bombers to the location. Suicide bombers were typically drugged and turned into zombies for their mission, but Omar was not the administering druggist. A medical unit did the drug prep before handing off the bombers to the explosives team, which made the suicide vests, fitted them with explosives, and tied the belts around the torsos of the bombers. Omar had told Aisha that one of the selected bombers was her best friend, and Aisha had been distressed about it. Blessing, Aisha's friend, was quiet and shy. She had taken her captivity extremely hard. She had been sickened from the moment of the raid at the school and vomited several times during the ordeal. She was severely dehydrated by the time they reached the camp after several hours of trekking through the bush. She passed out during sheriff's address to the new captives and had been revived by the camp's medical unit, which gave her water. Blessing, along with another girl, was given away to a fighter named Musa. Her co-wife handled the situation better than Blessing, whose health deteriorated and was treated repeatedly at the camp clinic. The ZOBBO leadership decided to get rid of her and had sent her to the suicide bombing unit, where she was now going to be expended with, if what Omar had told Aisha was true, and Aisha had no reason to doubt him. Ahmad was wide awake and alert as the bus that was taking him to ZOBBO town made steady progress along potholed and washed out roads. It was dark inside the bus. There were 50 people in the large bus, and they were all asleep except Ahmad. The driver, an obese and bald-headed man, chewed caffeine-loaded cola nuts to stay awake. Ahmad sat next to a middle-aged man who snored in his sleep. The ride was eerie, particularly in its second hour at midnight, when the bus was the only vehicle on the road in pitch-black savannah territory. Ahmad wasn't sure the driver could see well, for one of the headlights was broken, but the driver kept up a regular speed. He appeared to be used to driving with a broken light. Midway into the trip, the bus stopped at a dilapidated and empty bus station to discharge passengers. The driver pulled back onto the road several minutes later to continue the journey, and the bus was still the only vehicle on the road for miles in both directions of the two-way traffic. Road. The trip was Ahmad's first night road trip. He typically avoided them because of the risk of attack by armed robbers who waylaid vehicles, particularly large buses, and robbed passengers of money and other valuable possessions. He was on this night bus because he had to. He would do anything to get the love of his life back in his arms again. Sadiq sat across the aisle from him, asleep, and had been in that state since the bus had taken off. A little into the third hour of travel, the bus entered the vast ZOBBO main area of guerrilla activity. It was still dark, but from where they were, they only had another 30 minutes or so to arrive at their destination. Ahmad had found it strange that throughout the 3-hour-long journey, there hadn't been a single military checkpoint, yet a significant portion of the interstate road was a hotbed of ZOBBO insurgent activity. It was really none of his business anymore, he thought. After all, he was no longer a soldier sworn to be ready at any time to make the ultimate sacrifice to protect the state. In any case, the absence of checkpoints enabled a smooth ride because stoppage at any military checkpoint always carried the potential for dangerous drama, particularly where wanted individuals were apprehended or there was seizure of contraband and the individuals involved engaged the soldiers in a shootout. Ahmad had manned checkpoints before, and he was aware of how explosive the dynamics of checkpoints can be. The bus arrived at its final destination in a clearing adjacent to a thick bush. It was now a little after 2 a.m. Ahmad thought the bus stop was rather unusual, but he quickly figured it probably was created by ZOBBO, which owned the bus. He suspected that the 20 passengers who disembarked were all ZOBBO members. Why would their final destination be in some clearing, surrounded on 3 sides by thick bushes, and at such odd hours? Ahmad, along with Sadiq, Kabiru, and the young female suicide bombers, alighted from the bus. Just then, a bunch of motorcyclists appeared from nowhere. Many of the cyclists were armed with AK-47 rifles, and they stopped one after another to pick up the newly arrived passengers. Ahmad and Sadiq hopped on one, and it took off. The ride on bumpy and slippery footpaths lasted for about 30 minutes. The 3 men had squeezed onto the 2-seater motorcycle. Their rear ends were thus sore by the time they arrived at the ZOBBO camp. The moment was surreal for Ahmad, and at the same time exhilarating. His adrenaline pumped, for it was hard for him to believe that he was at the camp gate of the dreaded ZOBBO, and that upon being let in, he would set his eyes on Aisha again. The much for he had come in his mission was the easy part. The hard part, which would involve the actual extraction of Aisha from the camp lay ahead. The heavily guarded camp was still enveloped in the early morning darkness as the motorcycle approached and came to a stop by a few yards away from the gate. Sadiq approached the guards and was let in. He had asked Ahmad to wait outside while he processed his entry, which would involve a quick check of his name against the names of state secret police agents listed in a stolen classified government document. ZOBBO suspected the secret police of occasional infiltration into its ranks to disrupt its activities and make arrests. The national news media occasionally reported on ZOBBO moves in sensitive government agencies, from where they provided ZOBBO with pilfered top-secret documents of the government. Sadiq emerged from behind the massive gates in the company of several men armed with AK-47s. Ahmad observed them to approach. He was momentarily alarmed at the firepower they wielded, and he hoped nothing had gone awry in the brief interim Sadiq had been away. He hoped and prayed that all would be fine. His lips moved gently as he recited a prayer of safety. But his premonition of the possibility of something going unexpectedly wrong was immediately proven when he was tackled to the ground by the armed men. They beat and kicked him for several minutes. Ahmad lost consciousness from the attack, and his shirt was soaked in blood. Thinking he was dead, they dragged his seemingly lifeless body in the dirt into the camp and dumped him at the foot of a tree. Ahmad lay at the base of the tree for several minutes until 3 men arrived to remove what they thought was his corpse. But Ahmad had showed signs of life when he moved his right arm slightly and tried to lift up his bloodied head. He had miraculously regained consciousness and willed himself to live. The 3 men, led by a stone-faced man named Audu, briefly ran off in fright upon seeing Ahmad's head rise slowly, for they thought he was rising from the dead. They returned quickly to him after regaining their composure. A man who appeared to be the youngest of the 3 men pointed his rifle at Ahmad and was about to shoot, but was restrained at the last second by Audu, who wanted the execution to be properly carried out at the designated execution site. They picked up Ahmad and threw him in a wheelbarrow so they could easily wheel him away to the site. Along the way, Ahmad summoned the courage to speak. He was barely audible from the physical violence he had endured, but his would-be executioners could hear him. "I am innocent," he said weakly. "You are a liar," retorted Audu angrily. "You were sent here by the government to spy on us. You will be dead in the next few minutes," he railed ominously. When Sadiq and Ahmad had arrived much earlier at the gate to the camp, and Sadiq had briefly left Ahmad so he could go inside to process Ahmad's entry approval, a huge problem had been encountered, and it had to do with Ahmad's full name appearing on the stolen list of Secret Service officers of the government. Ahmad was immediately suspected of being a potential mole for the government, ZOBBO's sworn enemy. In actuality, the name listed in the stolen document was a namesake Ahmad had never met before. In ZOBBO's notorious brutal style, he was presented with no opportunity to explain, and he had been viciously attacked and nearly beaten to death. Audu and his men taunted Ahmad as they pushed the wheelbarrow up a dirt road. Ahmad kept protesting his innocence, reminding them that the Holy Book forbade shedding innocent blood, and that they would be committing a sin if he were to die in their hands. He asked them what his offense was, and they told him about the document that had implicated him as an agent of the government. "I am not that person on your list," he insisted. "I will swear by the Holy Book that I am not that person. My two names, Ahmad Ali, are common names. That Ahmad Ali in your list is somebody else. I'm not that person." ZOBBO's execution site was off the dirt road in a bush. 6 trees, which stood in a straight line 4 feet apart from each other, as if they had purposely been planted that way, were typically used as stakes to tie up the condemned before firing squads. Ahmad was wheeled into the execution spot, still protesting his innocence. The wheelbarrow was abruptly upturned, spilling Ahmad onto the ground. He winced as his aching body hit the hard earth with a thud. They stood him up and tied him to a tree for the execution. It was all over, he thought, and he began to say his final prayers. But before they lined up to shoot, they conferred for several minutes. Audu had started to believe Ahmad's claim of innocence. He had also been impressed with Ahmad's proficiency in his quotes from the Holy Book about the sin they were about to commit and the consequences of shedding his blood without proof of any crime he had committed. When they broke up the brief parley, Audu ordered Ahmad to be untied from the tree. He then grilled Ahmad about his past, his politics, religious fervor, and why he had decided to join ZOBBO. Audu was Sadiq's superior and a close confidant of Sharif. He had the authority to issue death sentence reprieves, and Ahmad became the recipient of this rare reprieve. Ahmad was in bad shape and needed treatment. They loaded him in the wheelbarrow again and rolled him out of the execution grounds and rode to the clinic on the far side of the camp. Ahmad had a good look of the camp during the ride. He observed women out and about, and many among them were pregnant. Kids played in the dirt. He also saw several mud houses, hundreds of men armed with AK-47s, dozens of utility vehicles converted to military use with machine guns mounted in the rear, anti-aircraft guns mounted on the edges of the sprawling camp, and a mosque. He caught a glimpse of a woman from afar who had a striking resemblance to Aisha. He tried to turn around to look in that direction again, but he had a stiff neck from the assault on him earlier. His heart palpitated as his mind was flooded anew with thoughts of Aisha. Might she be the person he had just faintly seen? That person had been about 100 yards or so away from the dirt road. Thus his inability to acquire a much clearer view of her. He convinced himself that it was her, and it reinvigorated his sapped strength. She was his cherished love, the person for whom he had endured much suffering and had come close to losing his life over just a short while ago. It was all worth it, he told himself, but he still had a long way to go to liberate her from the camp. End of chapter 5.